Welcome to Islam in the Natural World. My name is Kajatu Balde, and I am the founder and executive director of Faithfully Sustainable. Today, we are going to be diving into how Islam inspires us to care for the natural world. We are joined by Dr. Ali Hussain, who will share his powerful reflections on faith and the environment. And guiding our conversation is our incredible moderator, Dr. Megan Adamson Sijapati. So here's how things are going to flow with this discussion. We're going to start with insights and discussion from Dr. Hussain and Dr. Sijapati, and we're going to end with your questions. So any questions that you have, please save all of them to the very end. You can feel free to write it down in your notes app or a notebook, and we will get to them from the very end. So as we dive into this, the chat box here is going to be paused, and then we'll eventually turn it back on during discussions. But in the meantime, I am going to just quickly introduce Faithfully Sustainable, or FS as we call ourselves. This year, Faithfully Sustainable turns 5. Which is really exciting because we have changed so much since we first started this organization. So this introduction is actually more of a reintroduction to everyone. So Faithfully Sustainable, we are a national organization led by BIPOC Muslim women who are dedicated to really addressing environmental and economic injustice within the Muslim community in the United States. And it's a very exciting thing that we are fully Muslim women led, and something that we're very proud to be. Our mission is to create faith-based capacity building initiatives that catalyze Muslims to develop environmentally conscious practices and community-based economic systems that establish resilient, prosperous, and self-reliant communities. Currently, we are realizing this mission through providing educational resources, a lot of which you see on our social media pages, and convening discussions like these that we're having today. And ultimately, we aim to really foster networks of relationships that will allow us to establish these resilient, prosperous, and self-reliant communities. We work primarily with Muslim student associations, community-based organizations, and also local masajids. The local masajids piece is something that we're working to do a lot more work on in this coming year and the next few years, inshallah. Ultimately, really, we are striving to build a future where Muslim-led initiatives, solutions are at the forefront of tackling every environmental crisis. That is the vision that we've set for ourselves from the very beginning, and it's something that we're working towards achieving. So, let's just make sure we are... Nice. All right, so now we're gonna get into what this conversation is going to be about. So let's first introduce our moderator, Dr. Megan Adamson Sijapati. She is the chair of the Religious Studies Department at Gettysburg College, where her work bridges faith, justice, and environmental thought. Her expertise lies in the traditions of Islam, specifically or particularly Sufism, and she has spent her career in exploring how faith shapes our understanding of the world, justice, and the environment. Dr. Sijapati is also an author. Some of her works include Islamic Revival in Nepal, Religion in a New Nation, and Muslim Communities and Cultures of the Himalayas. Beyond academia, she is extremely passionate about building connections between faith and action, particularly in the areas of social and environmental justice. We are very lucky to have her as an advisor, and even luckier to have her moderating this discussion today. So finally, I just wrap up my piece and give it to Dr. Sejapati. My team is in the background. They are acting as hosts. So Dilber, who you all have probably seen her emails, our amazing events organizer. She is under the name of Faithfully Sustainable, the organization's name. And we also have Adna, who is under her name, I believe. They might jump in as needed, but you're free to message them independently directly if you have any questions. So, that said, I will hand it to Dr. Sajapati, and we're going to mute the chat box momentarily and bring it back during discussions. Thank you. Bismillah.
Assalamu alaikum all. Thank you, Faithfully Sustainable, for inviting me to be part of this incredible event. Very excited about it today. I am so delighted to introduce Dr. Ali Hussain, who will be discussing Ibn Arabi and his work and his own work with us today, and no doubt inviting us to think in new ways and to think of our lives and our responsibilities and our opportunities in new ways. Dr. Ali Hussain has a PhD in Islamic Studies from the University of Michigan, Department of Middle Eastern Studies. His research focuses on the image of Jesus Christ in the writings of Muhyiddin ibn al-Arabi. He's also a musician and an educator on the sacred dimensions of the creative process in Islam. His publications include A Nostalgic Remembrance, Sufism, and The Breath of Creativity. He's also the founder of the Adwaq Center for Spirituality, Culture, and the Arts, president of the Art Healing Project, and senior creative advisor at Green Medical Network Group. I am so delighted to meet Dr. Ali for the first time in person. I've become recently aware of your work, and I find it both inspiring and compelling intellectually, personally, spiritually, all of it. It's just a delight to be able to have this conversation with you. So.
Thank you very much. It's an immense honor for me to be here and to discuss this very much needed topic that, as I was mentioning, I have really never been invited before to speak about specifically Ibn Arabi in the natural world, or Islam in the natural world, from the lens of Islamic metaphysics and Ibn Arabi. So it's very exciting to sort of take a step into this frontier. Thank you very much.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, I have some set questions,
Sure.
so we can proceed with those, and of course, they will probably all kind of they might relate to one another, and so we'll see how the conversation
Sure.
flows. But we'll go ahead and just start. I know that many in our audience may be somewhat new to the study of Ibn Arabi, or we may have people here who know quite a lot and have been studying Ibn Arabi closely, either with you or in other capacities. Could you just give us a brief introduction to Ibn Arabi and tell us, what was particular about who he was, what was particular about him, and the particular era that he was living and writing in?
So Ibn Arabi was born in 1165 in what is today the city of Murcia in Spain, which is at the time was part of the Islamic Empire Andalusia. He was born into a rich family of a political diplomat, but during a change of dynasties. And so he also fled. So he was basically a child of war and diaspora. And he migrated with his family at a young age from southeastern Spain to southwestern Spain to the city of Sevilla, where he lived until his teenage years. And it's worth noting that a term that is somewhat problematic, but is used nonetheless by historians, convivencia, this idea of coexistence, that certainly Jews, Muslims, and Christians lived in this region. And as my advisor, Professor Alexander Kanish, liked to say, there were a lot of floating motifs among traditions and ideologies. Neoplatonism, for example, made its way to Andalus through the Ismaili Shi'i sect. So it was a very rich, intellectually rich, spiritually rich, culturally rich period. Ibn Arabi would then have a spiritual out-of-body experience almost when he began to seclude himself in the cemetery, in the local cemetery in Sevilla, where he met Jesus in a waking state, and he regarded him as his teacher. This began a lifelong journey of traveling between Iberia, so southern Spain, and then North Africa, until about the 1200s when he was in his 30s, and then he migrated towards the east. So Ibn Arabi pretty much visited every major city that you could think of at the time. So he visited Fez, Tilimsan in modern day Tunisia and Algeria, of course, all the city. And he was accompanying guides, right? Spiritual guides in a very peripatetic, mobile model of basically living at a guide's house for a couple of years and then, moving to another guide's house. It was always a traveling itinerary. And then towards the 1200s, he migrated to the east with his two of his students, and then he eventually stopped in Cairo, performed a pilgrimage in Mecca, went to Anatolia, Hebron, Baghdad, Mosul, eventually settling in Damascus. What's remarkable about this career is that he's also considered one of the most prolific of Muslim authors. By the most conservative estimate, he is theorized to have written about 250 works, two of which are considered the two most important books, the Meccan openings, Al-Futuhat al-Makkiyah, and Fusus al-Hikam, the Bezels of Wisdom. We could spend hours just talking about what these two books are about. But it's remarkable that he wrote those two books. So Al-Futuhat al-Makkiyah is about 6,400 pages. It belongs to an ancient genre of writing, of an encyclopedic exposition on reality, from the material realm onto the metaphysical realm. And I think that this is going to be a theme that we're going to be talking about today regarding the natural world. And then Fusus al-Hikam is a much shorter work of about 200 pages. And he wrote both of these works while traveling in the East due to spiritual experiences that he had in Mecca and Medina. Ibn Arabi passed in 1240. He had one major student, Sadr ad-Din al-Qunawi, who was his stepson. And what's remarkable about Ibn Arabi is he didn't establish a spiritual fraternity, what is known as a tariqah. His writings became kind of like the metaphysical fabric of every Sufi path after him. But one word I want to mention just to sort of highlight the importance of Ibn Arabi, and here I am thinking of James Winston Morris, who's one of the most prominent specialists on Ibn Arabi. He says, in a similar fashion to Whitehead's statement about Plato, we can say that everything after Ibn Arabi is an endnote to his thought. Ibn Arabi, Sadr ad-Din al-Qunawi, his foremost disciple, he had students who began a tradition of writing commentaries on Ibn Arabi's, specifically Bezels of Wisdom, the shorter work. And we find that, for example, one of these students, one of these commentators, Dawood al-Qaysari, his commentary became the foundation for the Ottoman educational system at the hands of scholars like Mullah Fanari in the 1700s, or earlier than that. Abd al-Razzaq al-Qashani would take the commentary on Fusus al-Hikam eastward to Mughal India, where it was taken by the Persian poet Abd al-Rahman Jami in the 15th century. And he wrote a commentary in Farsi on the Bezels of Wisdom. Now, Sachiko Murata wrote in her book, Chinese Gleams in Sufi Light, and I always mess up the title, is either Sufi Gleams in Chinese Light or Chinese Gleams in Sufi Light. But she wrote how Chinese Muslim scholars, Liu Ji and Wang Taiyu, because they didn't know Arabic, because the closest Muslim-speaking lands next to them were Farsi, they were Persianate lands, they used Abdurrahman Jami's commentary in Farsi on the Bezels of Wisdom to introduce Islam in a Neo-Confucianist light in China. And then in the 16th century, Hamza Fansuri would introduce Ibn Arabi's metaphysics into Southeast Asia. So what we're really looking at is that the major civilizations and cultural intellectual efflorescence after Ibn Arabi really goes back to him. It really retraces its intellectual genealogy to this incredible mystic and polymath. What attracts me to him personally, much of my work is with Muslim artists. I was born into a family of artists. And when I was doing my research in Ibn Arabi, I became very invested in the sacred dimensions of the creative process. And I was very attracted to Ibn Arabi's universality, his universal language. So you'll get quotations, for example, like reality is perplexity, perplexity is anxiety, and movement is life. So I could have this as a conversation with an atheist, and we would have a very fruitful conversation because of this. He's kind of speaking from the summit, right? He's kind of the voice of the siren song. So this is what attracts me to Ibn Arabi, and yeah, I guess we can go from there.
That's great. It's really just astounding when you remind us or you lay out the expansiveness of his works in terms of the
Yes.
volume, right? And also the expansiveness in terms of just the subject that he's treating, right? The nature of reality and the historical impact of it. All of it is really um, to be reminded of that. It's really striking. I mean, I can't think of another figure in Islamic history and Islamic thought who has had that
Yeah,
kind of impact.
absolutely.
Well, the next question that I was going to ask you was, what drew you to invest so much time in studying his works? I think you have given us a taste of that, and I wanted to ask you, what did it offer you regarding questions of
Yeah.
religion and
Well,
existence that you may not have found elsewhere? If you want to say anything about that, and then we might
sure,
transition into the
sure,
natural
sure,
world. Yeah.
absolutely. Well, as I mentioned, I was born into a family of artists, and I grew up in the Middle East, in a family where experiencing religion, for example, experiencing the sacrality and the beauty of Quran recitation was on a spectrum of experiencing musicality in the arts or Arabic music and things like that. When I migrated to the United States, I sort of discovered my faith in the United States, but I was met with this very deep dissonance in the American Muslim community in how they view the arts. It was a very foreign, it remains very foreign to me. Questions like whether music is permissible or impermissible, what kind of sculpture is it allowed, is it not allowed? These are discourses that are considered on the extreme margins of Middle Eastern societies and Arab societies specifically. And so when I came across Ibn Arabi, he sort of gave me a cognitive, imaginative framework within which to process this dissonance. And he affirmed for me that no, the arts can be a sacred medium for expressing and experiencing spirituality. As a matter of fact, it has been throughout human history. I mean, if we look at the major human civilizations, what remains of them is their arts. When we think of the Greek civilization, we think of poetry, we think of Virgil's Aeneid and the Iliad. When even the Pythagorean theorem was invented from the ratios of strings on a harp. When we think of the Egyptian civilization, we think of architecture, right? The pyramids. And inside the pyramids, we find drawings. And what did they draw? They drew musical instruments. So it's this layered sacralization of the arts that I became aware and this is what I say now publicly, is that there are three things that were sort of colonized among the Muslims at the beginning of the 20th century: land, metaphysics, and the arts. And these three things are connected. So Ibn Arabi and Rumi, until very recently, and it's still the case, so very much so with Ibn Arabi, it's not considered something that should be taught or spoken about. It's an elite academic discourse. And the arts, I believe, were colonized because it's a medium for chronicling suffering, and redemption. And I think that that's why there is an attempt to make sure that people forget. Islam, in pre-modern times, the arts were a central medium for expressing spirituality, calligraphy, architecture, so on and so forth. Even the guitar is the descendant of the lute, which of course was developed by the Christian troubadours who were influenced by Ziryab, the Iraqi musician who brought the oud from Baghdad to Al-Andalus. So Ibn Arabi sort of helped me synthesize and begin this journey of really focusing on his metaphysics as a lens to discuss the sacred dimensions of the creative process,
Yeah.
which is my work now.
Yeah. Oh, wow. Oh, beautiful. So I want to keep this tripartite
Yes.
thing that you just gave I want us to keep it in our minds a little bit. I think it might be helpful to come back to. But what you're saying about in parts of the Muslim world, the process of colonization took primarily three things. You're saying
Land,
access to, and also thinking land, metaphysics, and art. So,
and it's all tied to land, right? Because
yeah.
Exactly, because land is not just material soil. Right. There is a sacrality to material soil. And in order to understand that sacrality, you need the metaphysics. You need to see how the material soil is a metaphor for something larger in the unseen that is actually not abstract. And this is really important. We tend to think of something sacred as being completely disconnected from the material. Not at all. The material is a vessel for carrying the sacred metaphysical reality. And then the arts is, it's as Toni Morrison, may she rest in peace, advised a student in Harvard. She said, your story is the only thing they cannot take away from you. So make sure to tell your story. And we see until now the power of the poetry of Mahmoud Darwish, for example, or Ghassan Kanafani, or any of the other, even Iraqi poets like Ahmed Matar and others. So I think that art, and by the way, the other important thing here is that art, as in a collective culture, is always an expression of metaphysics. If you think even today about Star Wars or the Marvel universe or the DC universe, these are just modern reformulations of Greek mythology, of the infatuation with the superhero. Human beings are subconsciously drawn to that. In what native, indigenous, First Nation, the custodians of the land in America, when I spent time with them, for example, what they taught me is that these two things are tied together. The role of the hero is tied to the land, and it's tied to the metaphysics. So, the colonizers did their homework. They knew what things to disconnect and to disembody and to amputate, in order not for the generation of the time, but for subsequent generations to forget.
Right, because we're continuing to live in this.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So that's such a terrific lead in to you telling us about how Ibn Arabi sees the human being in relation to the natural world. I know it's a huge question, and
Yes.
I'm hoping you can talk about stewardship and
Yes.
and all of this. But if you could start by giving the audience just a kind of connecting this to Ibn Arabi's view of the human being and then the human being in relation to the natural world before we get into things about.
So this discipline of what we might call humanology is a very central pillar of Ibn Arabi's teachings, which is, to put it in basic words, everything other than God is a manifestation of God's names and attributes, or a vessel for manifesting God's names and attributes. And in this case, what distinguishes the human being as a khalifa or a vicegerent, as it is mentioned in the Quran, God tells the angels, I am putting a vicegerent upon the earth. The human being is chosen as a vicegerent metaphysically, due to the ability, the unique ability of the human being to manifest potentially the entire gamut of God's names and attributes. Once this manifests in a human being, that human being is regarded as al-insan al-kamil at-tam, the perfect and complete human. We usually, even many people in the realm of Ibn Arabi studies, we usually mistakenly call it the perfect human. First of all, the mistake is we call the perfect man, neglecting the role of the woman, right? No, it's the perfect human, first of all, but it's not only perfect, it's complete. And here is an important distinction that Ibn Arabi brings our attention to. What is the difference between completion and perfection? Perfection is reaching the highest standard in a particular character. So you could be perfectly patient, perfectly repentant, perfectly grateful, perfectly content. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you're able to appreciate where everybody else is at. That's where completion comes in. So completion is, even though you might have passed a certain standard in gratitude, you are still patient with others who are not that grateful. And these two are necessary for anybody to be a guide or to be a vicegerent, to appreciate where everybody, all of God's creation or everything in the universe, their specific rank or station at the time. So for Ibn Arabi, the human being is the potential culmination of the project of creation, which is explained in what's called the Hadith Qudsi, or a narration that is attributed to the Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, where God speaks in the first person, and he says, "I was a hidden treasure. I loved to be known, so I created creation that I may be known by them." So there are a few key things about this tradition. First, it begins with love. So, right, the first movement, Ibn Arabi says, of God towards creation is love. I loved to be known. And then also described as uttering the divine creative command, be. So his first movement was of love and speech, and our first response of love towards him is of listening and coming to be. Now, what is the relationship of the human being to the natural world in this case? There is something called maratib al-wujud, or the levels of being, the levels of existence. When we think, for those of us today who even believe in a spiritual realm, we tend to think of, we have this place and then we have the other place where God, angels, demons, hell, paradise, everything else is there. And then we have this physical material realm. The problem with this disconnected or disjointed theology is that there is no intimate way for the material to engage with the spiritual. Because as Ibn Arabi tells us, the material is three-dimensional and dense, whereas the spiritual is non-dimensional and subtle. It's not bound by time and space. So there is no chance for them to connect. So in Ibn Arabi's metaphysics, and this was the case even in Christianity and Judaism and many traditions prior to Aristotelian Averroism in the 17th century, there was an intermediary realm between the physical and the spiritual called the realm of imagination, alam al-khayal. Ibn Arabi describes it as a realm where spirits are embodied and bodies are spiritualized. It's the realm where we go to in our dreams. It is also the realm where we receive our creative inspiration. So these 5 realms, there is 5 levels of existence, beginning with the divine essence or divinity, then the spiritual realm, then imagination, then the physical material realm, and then lastly, the perfect and complete human. Now, what's remarkable is that all of these 5 realms, including the physical realm, are not only external realms or spheres of existence, they also exist within us. And this idea goes back to Greek philosophy, this idea of microcosm, macrocosm, that everything outside the human being is a mirror of what's inside the human being. Some Sufi masters have described three scriptures. They say there is the lined scripture, al-kitab al-mastur, which is what we usually regard as scripture that we read when we open a book. Then there is al-kitab al-marqum, the ciphered scripture, which is the human being. And the human being is ciphered or cryptic because in reference to like the DNA, something like that. And then there is al-kitab al-manbur, the witnessed scripture, which is the natural world and the universe. So in the Quran, for example, God says, we will show them our signs in the horizons and in their own self. And it's remarkable that the word for verse of the Quran, ayah, is the same word for sign, which means that there is a one-to-one correlation between every verse of the Quran and every sign in the universe. So you have this layered mirroring, which means that if we were to go to the nitty-gritty of environmental justice, everything that occurs of oppression on the natural world is actually emanating from an inner human deficiency. And human beings are projecting their own deficiency upon the natural world. What's beautiful here is I'm reminded of a Malian sage, Tiorna Bakar Tal, who described faith as being three states, according to the states of matter. The first one is ice, and he says people of ice faith cannot distinguish between water and the shape that it contains. They cannot tell that this is water and this is water. For them is just an ice cube, whatever shape it takes. And they're willing to declare war against anybody whose faith is different than theirs. Then there is people of liquid faith. And these are people who can distinguish between water and the container that it's in. And this is remarkable because Ibn Arabi quotes the 9th century Saint Junaid, who, when asked about gnosis, deep inner knowledge, he says the color of water is the color of its container, right? Mm-hmm. Incidentally, Bruce Lee also said, be like water, right? Water takes the shape of every container. And then the last state is the people of gaseous faith, and those are the ones who rise to heaven. Now, what's remarkable here is that Ibn Arabi tells us that just as a mirror reflection is always inverted. If you raise your right hand in front of the mirror, your reflection will raise its left hand, right? And if you raise your left hand, your mirror reflection will raise its right hand. Ibn Arabi says, this is a precise description of how we are mirror reflections of God. How so? Well, God's essence never changes. Our essence, our spiritual states go through constant changes. God's outward manifestations are never the same. They always go through fluctuations like waves of an ocean. Whereas outwardly, more or less, we remain somewhat the same. It is hard for us to tell our aging process. But if we take this principle with Tiorna Bakar Tal's states of faith, we see that there is a remarkable mirror reflection between the human being and the natural world. How so? We are supposed to melt our inner glaciers, going from ice faith to liquid faith to gaseous faith. When we don't do that, we oppress the natural world and melt the glaciers and melt the glaciers in the North Pole and the South Pole. So there is this very intimate relationship between the human being and the natural world. I will end this part by a very intimate embodiment of vicegerency, of khilafah that manifests in prayer, salah, which Ibn Arabi mentions that the human, in our Islamic formula of salah, there are 4 positions, the position of standing up, then the position of ruku', of bowing down, prostration, and sitting down. Ibn Arabi says these four positions succinctly embody the four kingdoms of the natural world upon which the human being has been placed as a vicegerent. The first position of standing up, qiyam, represents the human kingdom because they're bipedal and they're the only ones who stand up straight. The bowing down position represents the animal kingdom. And what's remarkable is Ibn Arabi says, the human being, when you enter into prayer and you go into a bowing down position, you're not only acknowledging your dominion over the animal kingdom, but acknowledging the animal kingdom as a source for knowing God. And this is a very, very important distinction of khilafah in Ibn Arabi's metaphysical lens versus other paradigms that might present the entire natural world as being under our control. In reality, the Khalifa, the vicegerent, is in service of the natural world. And in service not only because the natural world can't take care of itself. No. Metaphysically, animals know realities about God that human beings cannot. And as a matter of fact, Ibn Arabi looks at the word bahima, which means four-legged beast that's used in the Quran, and he takes it creatively to the word mubham. Mubham means obfuscated. And he says that's because animals receive divine communication that is mubham, obfuscated, which human beings cannot understand. And this is why many Muslim saints had guides in the form of lions, in the form of horses and camels. And this is chronicled throughout Islamic history. Just really quickly, the plant kingdom is really powerful. The plant kingdom is the human head goes into the ground, which symbolizes the root of a tree or a plant going deep under the soil. And then the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, he said that the closest that a person is to their Lord in prayer is during prostration. Prostration, the prayer actually was gifted to the Prophet during the ascension journey. And some have said that prayer is the ascension of the believer. So there is this beautiful imagery, analogy, where our head goes into the ground and our spirits are ascending to the divine presence. But it's the image of the plant. It's the plant that symbolizes the highest point of ascension, which is entering into the divine presence. Throughout the Quran, of course, God describes creating human being as a plant. For example, he says, Wallahu anbatakum min al-ardi nabata. God has made you to grow from the earth like plants. And in reference to Mary, he says, وَأَنْبَتَهَا نَبَاتًا حَسَنًا. God made her to grow like a good plant. And so there is a lot of imagery there. The word nabat is also from the same root as nabi, prophet, because the word nabi, nubuwa, has to do with two things: naba, news, and naba yanbu, to rise, to elevate, just like a stem of a plant rises. Lastly, the sitting position is in reference to, it symbolizes or embodies the mineral kingdom. Because the mineral kingdom, Sufi saints have always said that the end game of a seeker in their journey to God is to be like a rock. They're not moved until, they don't move until they are moved by God. And it is really remarkable that it is not human beings, it is animals, plants, and minerals that are used to teach human beings these high principles of journeying to God. Lastly, it is worth mentioning that the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ mentioned that before revelation was revealed to him, he said, I know of specific pebbles in a particular alleyway in Mecca that whenever I used to pass by them, they used to give me, they used to salute me and give me greetings. And so it's remarkable that rocks and pebbles, Islamically, recognize the prophethood of the Prophet Muhammad before he even received revelation. So all of this is to say that there is a deep sacrality for the human being, and the role of the vicegerent goes beyond simply taking care of the natural world.
Yeah. Wow, that's all. It's all so fascinating, and it's so beautiful too. It's like the picture when there's so much to say about what you just described, but one thing it strikes me is it also just presents this incredibly dynamic, alive, pulsating world of signs that are constantly in which we're so deeply embedded, even though we might think
Yes.
we can, at
Yes.
certain points pay attention to it and certain points not, but that's
Yes.
yeah. So in light of all of that, so you say it's not just about taking care, right? Taking care
Hmm.
of the earth, but can you tell us about stewardship and how Ibn Arabi's view can might help us think about the importance of stewardship, and maybe in relation to um, these um, principles of spirituality and um, self-realization and hukuk rights and all of this. I mean, if you want to combine
Ah,
those, that
yes, excellent. So first of all, regarding hukuk, it's very good you mentioned that. I think one thing Ibn Arabi wants us to come back to constantly is that any the most practical sense of stewardship, in order to be fully appreciated, has to be always tethered back to that non-abstract, very practical metaphysics. So for him, language is everything. And he's a master etymologist. So he always deciphers relationships and common roots between derivatives and words in order to create a metaphysical narrative. So the word hukuk, which means rights, is tethered to a few key terms, right? One of which is the name of God, al-Haq, right? Which is the truth or the real. And then haq by itself without the definitive article, which means truth or reality, or actually rights, like the right and responsibility of something. And then you have tahqiq, self-realization or self-internalization, self-actualization. And then haqiqa, reality. So Professor James Winston Morris keeps returning to this idea of tahqiq as being the foundational movement in all of Ibn Arabi's writings. This is really about tahqiq. What is tahqiq? Well, tahqiq is deciphering the reality, our own inward individual reality, by tethering it to the rights and responsibilities of everything around us as it is rooted in God. That is because remember, who we are just, everything outside of us is imprinted within. You cannot know yourself without knowing the natural world. You need the natural world to know yourself and to know God. Now, Ibn Arabi also talks about the notion of ilm, for example. He says ilm, knowledge, is from alama, sign. And he says this is the reason why the world in the Quran is called alam, because it's a matrix of signs. Which means, what does it mean to know a tree? I mean, we were to just ask this question, what does it mean to know a tree? It is not to know its chemical composition, according to Ibn Arabi. Ultimately, to know a tree is to know how a tree manifests God. And if you know that, you'll know what the rights and the responsibilities of the tree upon you are. This is the ultimate connection. There is a beautiful story from Ibn Arabi's childhood, when he accompanied his first guide. And this is mentioned in the most authoritative biography on Ibn Arabi, The Quest for the Red Sulphur. by Claude Addas, that when Ibn Arabi was accompanying his first guide, Abu al-Abbas al-Uraybi in Andalus, um, he suddenly developed a habit of carrying a dead fish. And this puzzled many of his friends and peers because they knew that Ibn Arabi's father was a very successful diplomat. And they were worried that Ibn Arabi is doing this in order to lower himself, in order to be humble, but there is a really foul stench that is emanating from the fish, and it's just gonna not look like a good image for his family. So they went to the teacher and they said, we know why Ibn Arabi is doing this, but could you just talk to him because this doesn't look. And the guide he knew that they didn't understand why Ibn Arabi carried the fish. So he said, why don't you ask him? Ask him why he's doing this. So Ibn Arabi told them, he said, I'm not carrying the fish to humble myself. I'm carrying the fish because I know God would not allow this corpse to continue to exist if it was not worthy of being a vessel for his manifestations. So I'm actually carrying the dead fish in order to honor myself because I know it's a medium for knowing God. So for Ibn Arabi, what the requirement of everything upon you is in terms of taking care of it has everything to do with its rootedness in God. And what this means is that even in, for example, in the laws, in the rules of prayer. So Ibn Arabi has like an 800-page section, one of his books, about the inward realities of Sharia, of all the laws of prayer. When it comes to wudu, to ablution, he says it's by consensus of legal scholars that you should not make ablution with still water because it can carry filth. So you have to make wudu ablution with running water. He says that's only the outward reality of it. The inward reality is that still water, nothing moves except that it's alive. Movement is a sign of life. Mm-hmm. So if you make wudu with still water, it's like you're taking on dead energy. And if you make wudu with running water, you're taking on living energy. I cannot overemphasize this. Ibn Arabi's vision of reality was that the physical and the spiritual were a seamless gradient. And everything that happened in the physical world, what he could see its spiritual reality, its spiritual manifestation. So not for example, not overusing running water, which is a prophetic advice. Yeah. Or not overeating meat wasn't just because there might not be, it's an abuse to animals or it's an abuse to the human body. It's because there is a spiritual reality behind that. And that's the root. Because everything that happens in the physical world is a metaphor. And the metaphor is made sacred by that which it dresses, which is the meaning in the spiritual world. And ultimately, for Ibn Arabi, the reason why we need to revere, much less not abuse, the natural world, the reason we need to revere the natural world is because it manifests God's names and attributes. So we're actually dealing with God. When we deal with animals or plants, we're actually communicating with God through the plants and through the animals.
So we're deeply embedded in this whole system and have our responsibilities as you've discussed them.
Yes.
In our relationality with everything, but it's ultimately about God and not about us. Even though we can use ourselves as a starting point. Is that kind of what you're saying? I mean, as a vantage point, in that that's all we have to work with when we start our embodied nature and our...
We have a potential to be vicegerents, but we don't automatically get to be the center of attention. It could very well be a butterfly that teaches us a lesson about God. And oftentimes it is. And actually, the higher in rank, if we were to say, to use that imagery, the higher in rank that a human being ascends to, a sign of that is more humbleness and humility in front of God's creation, because it's this realization that you're not communicating with a tree or a rock or a plant. You're communicating with God. And so that's what might be called the kashf, the unveiling, is to ultimately realize that you're not dealing with things that are in your control. You're dealing with living beings that are channels for God to speak to you. So any sense of believing that we are the center of attention, it's a catch-22, and it's a very paradoxical thing. The human being becomes a vicegerent once he realizes that he's in absolute need for everything around him. And it is such a paradoxical thing, but that is also what being a saint is, I believe. Saints are those who realize that their absolute fuqr, impoverishment and need of God in and through everything. And yes, what you mentioned about we each begin our individual journey, this Ibn Arabi calls isti'adad, our disposition, which is how God knows us at our most essential inner reality. And we discover that in our interaction with the universe. We discover that in our interaction with how animals deal with us, because the natural world is what might be described in Quranic terms as ummi, unschooled. But what I mean by that is not that they're ignorant, is that there is no buffered human indoctrination. They speak from a very pure level. Animals, plants, and minerals deal with human beings at a very pure level. And I was very humbled once when I met with an indigenous First Nation chief who told me that what's happening right now in the natural world is, if you imagine that people living in a household, and one person in this household, nobody speaks to them, nobody acknowledges them. What will happen after some time? This person will die, because it's as if they don't exist. He says all the natural disasters that are happening now is the natural world crying out to us, you're not building a relationship with us anymore. It's as if we don't exist. And so it's actually, it's more than just fossil fuels. At a much more intimate level, if we regarded the natural world in the same sacrality that Ibn Arabi is speaking about, which is the indigenous view of the natural world, not only would we not abuse the natural world, we would regard it as family. And that's really the objective. One of my teachers said, if your objective is justice, adl, you'll always fall short. If your objective is ihsan, perfective beauty, then you'll always at least reach the mark of justice. It's not enough that we want to say we don't want to abuse the natural world. No, we want this sacred vision of the natural world so that we will surely not abuse it, because we realize we need the natural world to know God. And we're dealing with our own selves. It is not something that is external to us, that is under our dominion. They're teachers, they're saints and sages in their fragility. A flower in its fragility is a sage. An animal in its weakness, it's a sage. And again, we come back to this microcosm, macrocosm, all the abuse, the hundreds of cows and chickens that are cooped up and made to eat food that is not meant for them, and trees that are being cut down, glaciers that are melting. All of this is a reflection of our own inner reality. And so it's a healing process that needs to take place. not only for the natural world, it has to begin with acknowledging our own inner oppression and that we need healing. And we need the natural world to be healed.
Yeah. Can you tell us about the story of the mountain of Uhud and in terms of a
Oh, wow.
teacher, a teacher in the earth itself?
Wow. So there were a few instances where animals and mountains spoke and came alive for the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The mountain of Uhud is a remarkable incident during a battle where the Prophet was bloodied, and they retreated and they went on top of the not really on top of the mountain, but they hid, secluded themselves in a small cave, and the mountain began to shake and tremble. And the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam put his hand on the mountain, caressed the mountain, and said, "Be firm, O Uhud, because standing on top of you is a mountain, and standing on top of you is a prophet and a Siddiq," in reference to his companion Abu Bakr Siddiq, and Shuhada, martyrs, who were the other companions standing with the Prophet. And then the Prophet told the companions that Uhud is a mountain that loves us and we love it. And the remarkable testimony here is that nothing is able to love unless it's alive. And so the mountain of Uhud is a living being. And this is a testimony that is not bound by time. I just actually came back from Mecca and Medina, and when you go to visit the mountain of Uhud, I mean, it's so weird saying this, but it's one of the most beautiful beings you could ever gaze at night and in day. It is just majestic, but it's this very beautiful majesty. It's this very serene, beautiful, august presence. And the Prophet ﷺ, of course, had also engagements with a camel. This is really important. He passed by a camel, by a people, and they told him, "O Messenger of God, we have a camel that's become very violent, and we don't know what to do with it." So the Prophet ﷺ went to the camel, and as soon as he came close to the camel became calm, licked his hand, kissed his feet, licked his feet, and then began to whisper something in his ear. And the Prophet ﷺ told the people, he said, "You are making this camel carry more than it can bear. And he is complaining that you are planning to kill him and slaughter him to eat his meat after he served you for decades." And the people, they were shocked, that because there is no way nobody had heard of their intention to slaughter, but the camel had heard. And so they said, "We will never slaughter it. We will never make it carry any weight. We will always take care of the camel." There is also another beautiful incident where there was a young boy in the city of Medina who had a pet bird. The boy's name was Umair, and the pet's name was Nughair, maybe a lovebird of one of these birds. And one day, Nughair, the bird, died. And the boy was very, very, very upset, crying. And the Prophet ﷺ, passing by him in order to console him, he asked him, "Oh, Umair, what happened to Nughair?" And scholars of the Arabic language, they wrote 8 volumes about the miraculous eloquence of this one statement by the Prophet, of the different ways in which it was made to console the young boy and from the death of his bird. So and the stories are endless. I mean, of course, the Prophet ﷺ also said that a woman, a pious woman, would be punished because she tortured a cat. And then a prostitute entered heaven because she took care of a cat. And a man entered heaven because he was drinking water from a well, and came a very thirsty dog that was dying from thirst. And so the man took his sandal, that's the only thing he had, and he took some water and he fed it to the dog. So there are countless incidents of kindness to animals. In one incident, actually, the Prophet ﷺ and his companions were walking, and one of them was bit by ants, and so they burnt the entire colony. And the Prophet was very upset. He said, "You burnt and you killed an entire nation that remembers God." And so this goes back to this idea of the sacrality of the natural world. And I should mention this because somebody might be asking, well, wait a minute. So what if they didn't remember God? Would it be okay to kill them? But this is the point. Everything remembers God. Everything is alive. Even things that human beings make, walls and doors and curtains and cars, they all remember God. It's mentioned in the Quran. There is not a thing save that it remembers God, but you do not comprehend their praise.
So we have just a few minutes left until we're going to open the Q&A. So I wanted to
Okay.
ask you one other question that you could probably speak for a very long time on. So maybe just give us a glimpse. But, you know, Ibn Arabi offers us so much, and you've given us just this glimpse of what he offers us. What do you think are the really key points that he offers us as in modernity? You know, we're living in this context in this time in which all of what you're describing, it can almost seem kind of like a dream of, you know, if
Yeah,
only we could all
yeah.
be in a world and live lives in ways that are as you describe, you know.
I
Um,
think,
yeah,
yeah, yeah.
how can you help us in thinking through this?
I think it's important first to recognize what led to the modern world, which is first, the Barian project of disenchantment,
Mhm.
right? Of disenchanting the universe. There is nothing special about what Ibn Arabi would call creation. It's not just the natural world. It's not just, whatever is under the ozone layer. There is nothing special about everything out there. The Circle of Vienna, the positivists, they also said that, if it cannot be understood by rationality, even if it exists, we don't care about it. So what we're trying to do with Ibn Arabi is we're trying to revive an ancient enchantment of our universe. And now we are coming back around in a different language of understanding that it's not only human beings who are alive. Plants are living, animals are living, minerals are living. And there is a sacrality and there is a need, not only because it is necessary for our own survival. This is the key. For Ibn Arabi, he says, it's not only about you. Animals deserve to be treated well because they have a sacred life to their own. It shouldn't only be in reference to the human being. They all have rootedness in God. They all have rootedness in ultimate reality. And more importantly than that, we are not simply caretakers of weaker beings. We are in need of the natural world in order to know ourselves and to know God. This is really what it's about as well. There is knowledge and communication that plants have, animals and rocks and waterfalls that we do not have, and mountains. And we need them. And we cannot understand it. We need them as teachers. This is an altogether different thing. And this is all about this idea of going from justice to ihsan. Yeah. That it is not simply enough to say we need to deal with the natural world. Look at the wording, deal with the natural world as if it's as if it's an inanimate thing, as if it's a passive party. It's not passive. It's very much active. It has things and knowledges to teach us. We need it, and we need to be humble. And I should say that art and creativity is actually central to this, because it shouldn't be remiss for anybody that art is resistance, and has always been. And even in our present day and age, there is an attempt to decolonize art in the form of making sure that the paper we print our books on and our poetry is not abusive to the environment, that our dyes and paints and colors are natural and organic, right? That we use natural materials in our musical instruments, so on and so forth. So it is important to translate Ibn Arabi's metaphysics through the arts, because that's how it becomes culture. That's how it becomes pop culture. That's how it becomes part of the mainstream collective consciousness and conversation.
Yeah, so it's not something separate that we think of as some activity towards, to building justice, which is there's good intention behind that, but it sounds, I mean, Ibn Arabi offers us a complete reorientation for
Yes.
what modernity has
Yes, because you actually have to change your perception of reality before you can deal with it.
Yeah.
And this is really the main shift, that first, the natural world is not disconnected from ultimate reality, and the natural world is a metaphor for ultimate reality, which makes it more sacred.
Yeah. So there's so much more that we can talk about, I'm sure, but it's time to open up for Q&A from our wonderful audience. So I think that those will be coming in to me through the chat. So we're waiting for, feel free to drop your questions in the chat, and we will be able to shape the discussion accordingly. Let's see. I don't see any coming through yet. Give it just another minute. Your discussion of the trees was really, I love the discussion of the trees. Sometimes when I'm out reading, I like to read outside. I like to be outside as much as possible, but I live in Pennsylvania where it's quite cold a lot of the year. Well, it's cold right now, but I'm always amazed.
One of the amazing stories, an indigenous chief told me, is he showed this to one of his friends. He said, "Go to that tree over there and whisper a color, and don't mention it." So he went and whispered a color, and then the chief went 10 trees down the line and put his ear next to the tree, and he said, "This is the color you whispered, isn't it?" He said, "Yes." He said, "Trees are great gossipers." Once the tree hears something, so he said, what the tribes used to do in the past is when they wanted to communicate a message, and there is a huge forest between them separating the two tribes, is one of them would whisper something to the first tree on one side of the forest, and then on the other side of the forest, almost immediately they would put their ear to the ear, and they could hear exactly what was said, because they gossip. So it's just this right, this great life in the trees.
Yeah, and it's funny how these things are, of course, now being shown. They're being, quote unquote, I always laugh, they're being proven by by science now.
Yeah, exactly.
The trees have these incredible networks underground, and they are actually communicating.
And only now is it valid, right?
Now is it valid? I know.
Yes.
Like meditation, contemplation. Now we see that it works, that it's real. Okay, so we have some questions. So Shireen asks, can you provide an explanation or response to people who say music and singing is forbidden? Yeah, and that's our first question. We have a few. Yeah.
So I have recently published a book called Istima', or is attentive listening, the sound way and listening for God. And I would encourage you to take a look into that book. Um, Islam is a very sound-oriented religion, music-oriented religion. Um, there is Islam creation, according to Islamic metaphysics, began with sound, and creation ends with sound. Revelation arrived as sound. And the Prophet ﷺ would describe the continuation of the arrival of revelation in terms of sound. He said it arrived like the humming of bees, like the ringing of a bell, and like a metal chain being dragged against rocks. In my book, I describe the history that has been exiled from our books. And there has been a concerted effort to remove entire chapters from Arabic books that discuss the deep, rich musical heritage of Islam until the 18th century. Nasr Dumayriya, in his book Intellectual Life in the Hijaz, before the 18th century, he says that in the 1700s, there were Muslim scholars in Mecca and Medina teaching music theory, teaching musical practice, and even holding private concerts. Al-Farabi, the 10th century Muslim philosopher, Ibn Sina, the 10th century Muslim philosopher, was the first one to cure people of mental illness using music. Al-Farabi's great book on music is still considered one of the major authorities on music theory. Let me just say this. There have always been different opinions about the permissibility or impermissibility of music and musical instruments. The difference in modernity is that in the past, the debates among scholars were never meant to dictate the life of everyday Muslims. It was an elite discourse. Most Muslims did not know how to read and write. Literacy movements happened much later on. Most Muslims could not afford to even live in a metropolis like Baghdad, where most of these jurists lived and had these debates. So there were always musicians. There were always poets. There were always sculptors. Imam al-Qarafi, one of the major Maliki jurists, was a sculptor. And he mentions this in his books. So we need to revive a lot. What I'm saying is the answer to this question isn't legal. It's not in terms of legal opinions. It's about the everyday practice of Muslims. And Shihab Ahmed, in his book, What is Islam? The Importance of Being Islamic, beautifully says that there were traditionally in Muslim societies two sources of authority: prescriptive authority of the scholars who set the outer guidelines for what is appropriate practice, and then there is what's called prescriptive authority and expressive authority, basically the authority of the individual to make sense of God, the Quran, the text, and in their own everyday life. What talents did God give you? If God gave you the talent to be a musician, this is the way you communicate with him. This was the traditional understanding of not only Muslims, Christians, Jews. Consider that Ibn Arabi, for example, says that the first instance of musical ecstasy, tarab, which is a term that's used to describe the ecstasy that somebody feels when listening to music. He says the first instance of musical ecstasy, tarab, that was experienced was by the divine throne when it heard the creative command kun. And as a result, the divine throne began to shake and tremble from happiness. And that's why we get the movements of the galaxies and the stars. He even says, when a musician plays their instrument, the sound actually doesn't come from the instrument. The sound is a portal that opens through the instrument to the divine, to the heavenly orbits. And so what we're hearing is the music of the rotations of the planets and the stars. So it all goes back to reviving that heritage.
That's spectacular. Wow. We should all check out your book, your new book. So we have a lot of questions. I'm trying to scroll through them all and catch
Sure.
them in order, but forgive me, those of you in the audience, if I'm not catching them in the right order. We'll try to do them all as time permits. Mohammed asks, what lessons are there for holding and navigating grief from within the Islamic spiritual and aesthetic traditions?
MashaAllah. Grief.
Grief, yeah.
MashaAllah. Um, there are a few hadiths where the Prophet ﷺ tried to console an elderly woman while she was grieving for the death of someone. And then she was overcome by grief, and she basically dismissed the Prophet. She didn't know he was the Prophet. And then when she knew, she came to apologize. And he smiled and he said, no, it's okay. Just know that patience, the reality of patience manifests in the striking of the befalling of the first calamity. But there is a connection to the story of Job, of Prophet Ayub, which Ibn Arabi beautifully, it's not directly related to grief, but is kind of related to pain. And he says some people have questioned Job, Prophet Ayub alayhi salam in the Quran, asking God to relieve his pain, and whether it should have been better had he remained patient and not ask God to relieve his pain. And Ibn Arabi says, it's only a foolish person who thinks that they could withstand the full power of divine tests and tribulations, that reaching a state of being called patient, once you reach that state, once you reach that station, your adab, or your relationship with grief, is seeking to be relieved of it. And that's at that point that Prophet Ayub asked God to relieve him of his pain, because he had already attained the state of patience. What's important about grief, huzun, is that it's a natural disposition that must be coupled before the coming of joy. There is a principle in Islamic spirituality that through their opposites are things known. Through their opposites are things known. But it doesn't mean that you feel grief to the sense, to the degree that you no longer seek to be relieved from it. And one of the problems today is that not only grief, but mental illness, depression, is oftentimes dismissed, especially by religious leaders, unfortunately. And the advice is given, just do dhikr, and it will go away, disregarding the fact that grief and deep emotional states are oftentimes tied to spiritual stations. So grief, depression could also be manifestations, different manifestations of what's called qabd, constriction, which pairs with bust, expansion. And just like there is always an ebb and a tide, there is a night and a day, our spiritual states also go through fluctuations. And there is an adab that is due to each state. There is an adab that is due to the states of constriction, and there is adab that is due to the states of expansion. What is due for ourselves when we are in one of these states is to realize that they will not last. And there is a beautiful, one of the directors table with Robert De Niro and Tom Hanks, and they were talking about, growing and maturing through the business of acting. And one of the things that Tom Hanks said, he said, nothing lasts. If you're doing well, it will not last. If you're doing badly, it will not last. This is a story of our existence in the physical realm. Most importantly, if somebody is grieving, we have to understand that where they are in their emotional state, there are specific responses that they will accept in their disposition in that state. It is not appropriate, even though it might be true for you, to dismiss the abode and the state that they are in, because that is a manifestation of God. So even a human being in grief, just like an animal is grieving, one of the beautiful stories is that the Prophet ﷺ used to lean on a tree trunk when he first built his mosque. And then when they built him a podium, the companions, they said, we heard the weeping of a child. And the Prophet stepped down from his podium and he went to the tree trunk. And we realized that it's the tree trunk, it was weeping because the Prophet ﷺ was not leaning upon it anymore. And the Prophet hugged the tree trunk and it calmed down. And then the Prophet said to the tree trunk, he said, I give you a choice, that you remain a tree trunk in this world or you are resurrected with me in paradise. And he said, the tree picked to be resurrected with me in paradise. And so it was given the burial of a human being. The tree trunk was wrapped in a shroud and given the burial. So these are all lessons, right? That grief is a spiritual state that has to be, that has its sanctity, that should be respected.
It's so important, I think, for us to, I mean, there's so much grieving happening right now. We're all
Gosh.
grieving, and when we're talking about the earth and our,
Which, by the way, I mean, this space to even talk about metaphysics when there is a genocide going on is a very big privilege. But it's a privilege that comes with its responsibility. It's a conversation that needs to happen because we can have it.
Yeah.
Because we can have it, it's a conversation that needs to happen and needs to be translated into action.
On that note, we have a myriad of fantastic questions, and there are three that I am going to try to combine into one for you to answer for us in just a few, 2.5 minutes. There's a question from Saba about what's the best way to engage community masajid on environmental awareness. Saad also then asks, what would it look like for a community to build systems on this framework? So these are all kind of interrelated. And then Rod has asked, from Ibn Arabi's writings, does he indicate to us what practices to conduct, how to heal the earth in today's world? So I'm hearing from all three of them, you know, this desire to hear from you a little bit about how does this become something we enact, especially in our individual communities? So I'll leave it at that. Last question.
Well, it depends on the communities. Unfortunately, many Western Muslim communities are are immersed in capitalism from the ground up. The perspective, you know, I mean, I've went to masajid where they have lectures on 401ks and how to invest in your retirement, and all of that. Capitalism has, and the Protestant ethic, really, this idea of accumulation of wealth as being a sign of strong belief and strong faith, has become a status quo and still is, even though the world order is eroding. So I think it's multiple things. On the one hand, we can take practical lessons of teaching things that are at least in the Quran, which is that animals and plants remember God, so they're living beings. And that means that there is a stewardship that we can take at an immediate level. Ramadan is coming, for example, we don't have to have meat every day. I mean, that's a very basic thing. The Prophet ﷺ used to have meat once a month, maybe, if that was available. To go more green in terms of utensils and straws and plates and all of that, to be more conscious in clothing, to even plan a day where you plant trees, to teach your children to plant trees and to sit and make dhikr amongst trees, and to sit one of my dear friends, Sheikh Muhammad Adayan Kamendis, would beautifully go on retreats of stargazing. And he's the one who actually took me to meet the indigenous First Nation chiefs, and it was an amazing experience. So I think these are immediate steps that we can take that doesn't go into the teachings of Ibn Arabi, which brings me to the second part, which is reviving the heritage. And that has to do with dismantling and decolonizing the collective mind, which is basically reviving and decolonizing what has been colonized. The three things, right? The tripartite land metaphysics. We're working on land. People understand the power, the importance of decolonizing the land, but the metaphysics and the arts, I'm working on the arts and the metaphysics. That is absolutely necessary for us to work on that because we need to create the alternative, and it's not really an alternative, is the traditional ancient prism that then can stand as a mirror for this capitalistic thing to look and see, okay, this is not working. Let's try this. This is amazing. This is vibrant. This is a very great, amazing way to exist in the universe. And also regarding Rod's question, because the entire universe, trees, animals, plants, stars, planets, they're all manifestation of God's names. That means they harmonize with certain names of God that we can use to recite. And we all know, everybody has had this experience that they will do a dhikr of a particular name and they will see trees swaying and or flowers responding, animals responding. It is enough that the Quran mentions bees, has an entire chapter on bees and ants, and bees are described as receiving revelation from God, because it says, وَأَوْحَى رَبُّكَ إِلَى النَّحْلِ, your Lord has revealed to the bees. So I think going with that conviction next to nature and doing those rites and those native indigenous people, they tell me they have rituals of healing the water, of going with a bucket. One lady I know, she went to one corner of Lake Michigan, which is in Michigan, and took a bucket, filled it with water, and walked to the other side of the lake in Chicago, all the while reciting a prayer for what? To heal the water. This what we learn, what Muslims can learn from indigenous First Nations is how to revive the perception of the natural world as living, as responding, as responsive. And so this is key, by the way. One thing that we can do, that we need to do, is to seek sacred permission from the custodians of the land. This is absolutely necessary. And I've been telling Muslims this for a decade at least. If you are a Muslim and you want to open an institution or a seminary in a particular state, you need to go and seek permission from the tribe, because they're the custodians of the land, and they have divine permission to communicate with that land. And if you do, everything in that land will support you. So these are some practical steps I think we can take.
MashaAllah, it's wonderful. Thank you. It's already 11:33. Sadly, we have to wrap this up. Hopefully, it's the beginning of many more conversations among us all. And thank you for this incredible wisdom and erudition and the inspiration.
It's been my honor. Absolutely. I hope something good comes out of this. I hope people take some kind of practical approaches, and I hope the conversation continues with Faithfully Sustainable and those attending in various ways.
Wonderful. I believe now that there will be some concluding remarks from our wonderful leaders at Faithfully Sustainable. So I will go ahead and, is that correct? Yeah.
Yeah, hi. Just wanted to take a quick moment. If everyone would like to turn on their cameras and maybe just say hello real quick or goodbye. Um, and I also wanted to use this opportunity for everyone to be able to just say hello and say thank you on behalf of Faithfully Sustainable to our lovely, lovely moderator, Dr. Megan Addison Sijafati, and also to our wonderful guest, Dr. Ali Hussain. And I can't tell you how many people have responded in the chat saying, I need to watch this again. So thank you all so much for tuning in from wherever you are, all over the world. Thank you so, so much. Also want to give a special shout out to our founder, Kajitsu, who you saw in the beginning, and our co-coordinator, Adna, who has helped make this possible. And I also want to encourage all of you to follow us on social media, our Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, visit our website. However you'd like to engage with us, please feel free to do so. And also, if you still have any further questions from this conversation, please feel free to send me an email. I just put my email address in the chat, and hopefully we can find a smooth way to connect you with Dr. Ali Hussain. And also, yeah, we'll just be on the lookout. I'll be sending out another email shortly with the recording so you can digest and have some time to review all of the wisdom that we've taken from this chat. Thank you so much. Thank you, Sharifa, for that comment. And also, yeah, so thank you so much. Hope you all have a wonderful day. We'll also be sending out a quick survey if you took value from this conversation and want to see more conversations just like this and more. Please help us do that by letting us know what you think in the survey that we'll send in addition to the recording. So thank you so much. Jazakallah khair, and have a great day.
Thank you all. Bye.